Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to PPU Talks, a webinar series developed by the PPU Secretariat of Stellenbosch University, South Africa, which is wanting to raise awareness on issues related to disaster risk, resilience, and sustainability in Africa and across the globe. We want to really warmly welcome Professor Ian Davis joining us today. Professor Ian Davis has got quite a remarkably long list. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to make the presentation move of sort of the different accolades and different institutions that he's worked at, but I'll let him introduce himself just now. But today's session is Form Follows Failure, the impact of failures from disasters on architecture and urban design. So without further ado, just before we begin the session, I'm sure many of you are veterans of these PPU talks before and have attended many sessions. Just as a quick reminder of the etiquette, to please mute your microphones and turn off your videos if possible to save on bandwidth. We ask you to use the chat function to post any questions that you may have, or to raise your hand if you wish to communicate. And as I mentioned, also please post any questions in the chat, and then towards the end of the session, Professor Davis will respond to your questions, and we'll also raise them to him later at the session. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Ian Davis to have the floor and to introduce himself. Professor Davis, are you ready?
Ready, yes.
Perfect stuff. And also, Professor, please just tell me when you want me to go to the next slide, and I'll be happy to do so.
Great. Well, it's a great pleasure to be taking part in this session today. I have very happy memories of South Africa. We had a visit, one of our courses, from somebody called Pat Reed many years ago, and she'd helped develop a law in South Africa which has been very influential in disaster risk. I went out to one of her conferences in Grahamstown and also various conferences in Cape, and it's a great pleasure. And Stellenbosch was a wonderful place to go to, particularly some of the wineries, wonderful. So it's a great pleasure to link with you, and I hope this is interesting. I don't suppose many of you are architects or urban designers on the group watching today, but that's my background. I was an architect, and a long time ago, and architecture has always fascinated me, and my son and granddaughter and all our family is just full of architects and landscape architects and architectural historians, so it's in the blood, as it were. And this talk began back in 1983, a long time ago, when my professor at University College London was 75 years old, and we all had to produce a kind of Festschrift volume to celebrate his life, and I chose this topic. So I wrote about it, and I think this is the first time I've ever given a lecture about it, but anyway, but it's an interesting area because architects are preoccupied by form following function, and I thought, well, maybe not, maybe something different. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about. We're going to distribute this PowerPoint to anyone who wants it afterwards, and you can share it and use it wherever you want. And I just hope you find this talk stimulating. And I should say that it's not just for architects. It will be, I hope we can talk about other forms following failure than buildings, like plans following failure, or new bylaws, or new construction guidelines. All sorts of things follow failure. So can we have the next slide, please? The presentation was based on this document in case any of you want to do any archival looking, but as you can see, it's a very long time ago. So things have changed, and maybe some of you might communicate with me and bring me more up to date on this subject. Thank you. Next. I like this quote: "Failure isn't a crime, failure to learn from failure is." We all make mistakes, we all fail, and societies fail, and the media is often pretty merciless to them. But when we fail to learn from these failures, and when we don't take action, that's when the real trouble starts. Next, please. I had the pleasure of a Chinese professor sharing my office in Oxford, here where I live, some years back, and one day he wandered into my room and said, you've got a really rotten word in English for disasters, haven't you? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, disaster, it's a bad word. I said, yes, it's a bad word, but it's a bad experience. He said, yes, but what I'm getting at is that there's no hope in the word disaster, is there? I said, no, I suppose it's negative, wholly negative. He said, yes, quite right. He said, well, we have a much better word in Mandarin, and many of you will know this. The word is crisis in Mandarin, and it comes from two roots. One is dangerous, and the other word is opportunity. And what Chico said to me was that whenever he said, I'm in Guangzhou working in my office on flood risk, I hear this word crisis, I think of the danger of floods, but I also think of the opportunities that they bring. So he said, for Chinese Mandarin speakers, disasters offer opportunities, and it's written into the word, not in your case. So I just think disasters do offer opportunities, and this talk is about some of the opportunities. Next, please. There are six, I'm talking to disaster people who know a lot about this subject, and much more than I do, I expect. So this is basic stuff. But I think there are six things you can do with disasters. You can ignore them. Let's hope you don't do that. You can manage or prepare for them. You can accept them, living with them by adapting to them. That's one of the whole processes going on with climate change. How do we live with climate change? How do we adapt to it? You can transfer the risks, possibly using insurance mechanisms. You can reduce them. And in some cases, you can prevent them. But I'm very wary of this word prevent, because we all know you don't stop an earthquake and you don't stop a tsunami or a tropical cyclone, but you might be able to reduce them. So I think prevent gives a false sense of security. Next, please. So I think we reduce it down to four. We manage and prepare for them with preparedness and all our management tools and techniques. We accept them by living with them, trying to adapt to them, and trying to encourage people to work with them and get used to them and see them as something they've got to prepare for, just as we prepare for winter in England. We might be able to transfer them. That might not reduce the risk. It might simply move the risk to somebody else. And we certainly can reduce them. There's no doubt about that. And that's been the big focus of UN policies, Sendai framework, etc., etc. So this talk is really about, I think, about accepting them and designing buildings which will cope with these risks as they happen. Next, please. In architectural lingo, there's a whole lot of words for form follows function. It came about in the 19th century, and it was the kind of mantra which underpinned functionalism, which was a whole doctrine of modernism, which affected the whole modern movement in architecture. Some wags turn it round and say function actually often follows form. The architect gets the form and tries to squeeze the function into it. And that certainly has been the case in many cases. But form also follows fashion, and it follows culture. And form follows form. People copy a form from one place. The Capitol in Washington, D.C. bears a similarity to St. Paul's Cathedral, and St. Paul's Cathedral bears a similarity to St. Peter's in Rome. Form follows form. And what I came to the conclusion in working in this was that form follows failure. That's what I'm going to talk about. Next, please. So this is the focus. I want to discuss, or even celebrate, to be honest, certain examples of remarkable innovations in building structures. Perhaps in one case, in one or two cases on building regulations, some changes in technology that followed past failures, and these were caused by natural or human-created hazards. Next, please. Let me begin with earthquake risk. This isn't a problem which besets so many parts of Africa, but nevertheless, it's been significant. And it's important because earthquake and buildings are close relations. 98% of the people who die in earthquakes die because of building failure. That isn't true of the other hazards. So any architect, any engineer, any urban designer working in hazard-prone areas is very, very conscious of earthquakes and the risks they pose. Next, please. There's a quite wonderful church in Istanbul. It's been recently called as a museum or a mosque, but it was originally a church, and it was built in the year 537, one of the great early structures of architecture. And this great church was built after the time of Constantine, and it had a very flat dome. And the flat dome collapsed in an earthquake in 586, which was just 50 years after it had been built. A great tragedy for the people. Now, what was so clever was that the redesign decided that the dome was too flat, it needed to be taller, it would bring down the load more clearly on the base, and it needed ties around the base. If you imagine a cup upside down, just imagine a bit of metal around the rim to hold it together. It's like a ring beam. And that redesign incorporated that brilliantly. And also they put 4 great buttresses on either side of the dome, not on all 4 sides. They put them on either side, and they put little side domes, half domes on the other 2 sides. You can see these buttresses in the picture. And yet again, the thing collapsed again in 989, and it had to be rebuilt again. So in the earthquake-prone city of Constantinople, later called Istanbul, earthquakes are ruling supreme, and this building's taken a battering, but it's a remarkable early example of seismic design. Next, please. I did this sketch while I was taking some students there, and you can just see that buttress on the right-hand side, and right round the base of the dome is hidden inside it is an iron chain, and that is taking the thrust as the load of the dome is exerted, and it stops it pushing the dome outwards. Next, please. So that's where the iron ring beam was inserted, right round the base of it, and this just shows the way it was rebuilt after earthquake collapsed. A very different design. That technique of putting an iron chain around the base of a dome was applied by Christopher Wren in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Next, please. We move on a long way to nearly 1,000 years, or just over, to Lisbon in Portugal, the capital of Portugal. And in the year 1755, an absolute catastrophe happened. There was an earthquake offshore in the Atlantic Ocean. And this earthquake produced tremendous ground shaking in Lisbon and in the other cities of that part of Portugal. Many of the buildings collapsed, and they ignited and caused a fire. And about, I think, 17 minutes or so after the earthquake, a tsunami roared up the river Tagus and inundated the city. So this poor city got it in the neck 3 times over: earthquake, fire, and tsunami. The tsunami was so powerful, it even reached Norway. And it caused extensive flooding in Britain. So this tsunami affected the whole of Europe, and it caused deaths in North Africa. Next, please. The picture on the left-hand side, those of you who know Lisbon won't be able to recognize it particularly well, because the one on the left shows winding streets and a higgledy-piggledy medieval city with a large square facing down to the sea, or the river Tagus, the estuary of the river Tagus. Well, the earthquake destroyed that whole central area, which was on alluvium, and it left the buildings on the rock of the outcrop intact on the right-hand side. So you can just see the radical change that happened in the redesign of Lisbon after the earthquake. It became a rectilinear grid plan, and this was the first urban plan designed really in light of hazards. Next, please. They had brilliant engineers working in Lisbon. Next slide, please. Thank you. And two of the military engineers, Manuel de Meyer and his colleague, they in their 75th year, they designed buildings which were like a wooden cage with a lot of cross bracing in it, angled bracing. And they changed the technology from stone to wood, and they knew that this would better resist ground shaking. They filled in the wooden cage with plaster and laths to make it look like stone, but it wasn't stone. And there was a radical change in technology. One of the first examples of urban change in architecture. So next, please. So in Lisbon, you've really got three things happening. You've got, well, three or four things happening. First of all, this is the main square. And they raised the level up of the square because of tsunami risk. And they used the rubble from all the buildings to help raise it. They put in water fountains to help fight a future fire. Next, please. And the whole design of the city was really modeled on anti-earthquake processes against earthquake and against fire. The first example of urban planning anywhere against a major disaster. Next, please. So the remarkable lessons from this, you've got these points: raising the level of the main square, water hydrants. Well, they weren't really hydrants, they were like fountains where people could fill up buckets to fight future fires. They controlled the heights of buildings because they felt that if they were lower, people could escape more easily. And there was earthquake and fire resistant construction. Lisbon has not had an earthquake since on this scale. They've had plenty of ground shaking. And so many of the buildings still survive from that time. Next, please. I just think of another earthquake example right up to date, well, nearly up to date. In 2006, there was a tremendous earthquake in Pakistan, which caused great havoc in Kashmir region, affecting both India on one side of the national boundary and Pakistan. And it caused absolute havoc in the rural areas and many of the towns of Pakistan. A remarkable coincidence of events happened afterwards. There was an Irish architect called Maggie Stevenson who was implanted into the Pakistan government by the UN Habitat, and she worked with a man called General Nadim. And General Nadim was in charge of the army in the area, and there was going to be a military task force to rebuild the rural areas. And he had worked in a village, lived in a village, and had a lot of village confidence. And Maggie rather persuaded him to have, rather than rebuild all these houses using government programs, to train local builders by the army in safe construction and change the construction from masonry to timber frames with diagonal bracing and infill, with lightweight roofs instead of these heavy earthen roofs. And over 700,000 houses were built in that technique, the most ambitious and complete program that's ever happened, I think, of safe building after an earthquake. I went to visit it and saw these houses. By the way, that house on the right has got far too much strengthening in it. It doesn't need anything like as much as that. But the people were very happy to live in these houses, although they found them too small and they missed the flat roofs above where they could actually sleep in the hot weather. So these lightweight roofs posed a problem. Also could be very noisy in the monsoon time. Next, please. The lessons from Pakistan was it is possible to make changes in well-established building traditions, particularly if the occupants can see evidence of the value of the safer form of construction. And I think a really important lesson for everybody is that the process of building, including training, the use of cash donations, getting people onto the banking system, this can be just as important as the product, a safe building. And what Pakistan showed us is that they had tremendous progress in developing this whole system. And I was delighted to meet many of those people who were so thrilled to have a bank account through their local post office. And the government gave them cash grants as opposed to grants in kind, so they could spend it on what they wanted. In many cases, they didn't opt for building, they opted for sewing machines and other things to help them with their livelihoods. Next, please. Structural failure, another kind of form that follows failure. Next, please. Just after Christmas, I had the pleasure of visiting this wonderful cathedral again. This is a Norman cathedral. That's a Romanesque cathedral, 1,000 years old, in Ely, which isn't very far from Cambridge. And it's built on a marsh, on a sort of outcrop in the marsh, and it had very dodgy foundations, and the tower collapsed. So you can see in the photograph there, you can see the tower on the west front, but in the middle, something poking up, and that's called a lantern. That's where a big tower was, and it collapsed. And they rebuilt it in a radically different technology using wood, and they created what's called the Ely octagon. So a more lightweight structure was created because they didn't want another collapse. And I'll just show you what it looks like from the inside. Next slide, please. There it is a bit, you can see it more closely. So it's a wooden structure which is covered with stone, or to make it look like stone, but it's actually wood. And gigantic trees were hoisted up to build it, following this collapse of 1322. Next, please. And if you ever get a chance of coming to England and go to Ely, just take a look up at this octagon, because it's quite spectacularly beautiful. This is the octagon looking with the light pouring down, and it is cantilevered over from the supporting structure. And it's just a completely radical change of technology. Christopher Wren, the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, his uncle was the Bishop of Ely. And I think he must have known about Ely and probably visited it. So when he built St. Paul's Cathedral, he copied this technique, but this time in stone with a dome. Next, please. So a lightweight structure was needed to replace the heavy stone tower. The design meant lifting 8 wooden beams, 27 meters above ground. Each beam was 19 meters in length. It was all the work of a man called William Hurley, the King's master carpenter. As I said, the design has never been repeated, but it would influence the dome that Wren placed over the crossing in St. Paul's. But it's an example of deliberate attempt to lighten the weight of a building that collapsed due to unsure foundations and stone construction. Next, please. Fire. Well, this is a very common risk everywhere, and any architect grows up with knowing how to do this. If you talk to an architectural student, next please, he will show you his design, and there's a staircase at each end of a corridor. And if you say to him, why is there a stair at each end of the corridor? And he'll say, I don't really know. Or many of them don't really know. But the answer, of course, is means of escape. If you get trapped in the corridor, you can get out by an alternative way out. So it gets into the blood of architects, and it gets into the blood of engineers and fire safety officials. And fire is a key factor, as we're finding to our cost in Britain, following a dreadful fire in an apartment building caused by the cladding igniting. A word about fire resistance in cathedrals. In medieval cathedrals, stone vaulting was inserted below the wooden roof. So this picture here, there's a wooden roof above that. And this was to stop the cathedral fire from coming from the inside, caused by candles falling over, things like that. And they used to have lots of drapery hanging in cathedrals, and that would ignite and be a huge fire. But the stone was there to stop the fire. It also was there to reflect sound. It had a double function. Now, many of you remember the fire in Notre Dame in Paris in 2019, when the whole roof was destroyed. In that case, it worked the other way around. The fire was in the roof, caused by an electrical failure, and the dome, the vaulting, stopped the fire getting to the cathedral. So it worked the exact reverse way round. But this was a remarkable protection. Next, please. London was destroyed in a fire, or City of London, not the whole of London, the City of London, which is near the financial district by St. Paul's Cathedral, was destroyed in 1666. London was weakened because there'd been a great plague the year before, 1655, and many people had left their houses, so many houses were unoccupied. Unoccupied property is always a bigger risk than when it's occupied. And St. Paul's Cathedral was destroyed, and the whole city suffered this fire, which lasted 11 days, remarkably only killed about 46 people. But people were evacuated all over the country. In fact, where I live in Oxford, people were allowed to come here and practice their trades as a kind of livelihood recovery method. Next, please. One side of the fire was protected by the River Thames. And within days after the fire, all sorts of schemes were being prepared by opportunistic planners to rebuild London quite differently. In fact, one came from Christopher Wren, who was the surveyor to King Charles II, and he proposed rather like a plan, a bit like what was to happen in Lisbon 80 years later with a grid plan, and he wanted to get rid of these narrow streets, which were fire traps. Well, that got short shrift by the financial community, who didn't want anything to do with it because they wanted to keep it the way it was. And it would have certainly created tremendous chaos in rebuilding London with all the legal entanglements of changing the plan. Next, please. But what did come, what remarkably did come, was the new London Building Act. And the Building Act stipulated the heights of building, the materials for the walls to be brickwork, not wood, and crucially, up in the roof, between each terrace house, the wall used to go right up to the top floor. Then it was open, so you had a long, open area right through the roof space. And the fires just ran along through that roof space and dived back down into buildings. Fires can travel horizontally. So they knew that was a problem. So they insisted that the party walls between each terrace house went right up into the triangle of the roof. The London Building Acts were enforced rigidly. And they said that anybody contravening the law, they would be brought into the middle of a street and beaten until their back was bloody. There was no messing about. That was a bit less onerous than happened in Babylonian culture, where under the time of Nebuchadnezzar, many thousands of years earlier, if a building collapsed, the son of the builder would be put to death. Not the builder, the son of the builder. They thought that would be a better incentive to make sure that people didn't shortchange with building. So building acts have existed a long time, but the London Building Act still exists and is still active and has prevented a fire ever since. Next, please. And houses look different. They were much higher. They weren't so. The streets were widened where they could, and they kept the heights down so that people could escape more easily from houses, and they could be easily fought. The fires could be fought more easily. So the whole architecture of London changed after the fire. Next, please. And it got a new cathedral. The cathedral, which took about 85 years to build, was a remarkable example of classicism by Wren, the brilliant polymath architect who was also an astronomer and a natural scientist. And that building, of course, survives and is greatly loved. It was an introduction of a completely new architectural form to suit a new liturgy of the Protestant church, because the previous church had been designed as a Catholic church. This was Protestant. Next, please. So here are lessons from London. First, building regulations of any city in Europe. They're still in use. Changes in street widths, building heights, building materials, fire protection. Original street plan was retained due to strong pressure, so they didn't win all the battles. The street plan replicated the old street plan, but a radically new cathedral, and no less than 87 churches were destroyed, and Wren designed 50 new churches. Please. And the Chicago fire of 1871, another great fire which had far-reaching implications for high-rise architecture. Next, please. What happened here was that the original structures, many of them unprotected iron columns, buckled in the fire. So the whole focus was on protecting the columns, which are now going to be built in steel. Steel had been invented about 1867, or being used in buildings from 1867. And here this new material was being used for high-rise buildings, which they covered with terracotta, and they also protected the steel on all sides to stop the fire getting to it. So fire-resistant construction was introduced. Next slide, please. And this presented a very, very different city. The home insurance building, designed by one who rejoices in the name of William Le Baron Jenny, is now demolished, but this building was built entirely in steel frame and with fire resistance, the first use of fire-resistant protection to a steel frame structure anywhere in the world. And from there on, that influenced buildings all over the world. Next, please. Let's move on to high wind risk, the risk posed by wind. Next, please. In Scotland, there was railway mania in the 19th century, and gradually railways were being extended into the highlands of Scotland. And great celebrations in the 1870s when a bridge was built across the River Tay in Scotland to help take railways right up into the mountains. And the wealthy of Britain wanted to go up there very badly, and it was great joy in that celebration. But a few years later, the whole bridge collapsed in a fantastic storm with a railway on top of it. This caused national outrage. How could this amazing structure be collapsing in this way? And so there were public inquiries put in place. Next, please. The public inquiries realized that the wind loading was far too low. They had consulted the Astronomer Royal of all people to find out what wind speed buildings should resist, and he gave it a factor of about 10 pounds per square foot, and that was not nearly enough. So they increased it, and as a result of the increase, they sacked the architect for the Forth Bridge, who was the same one as the Tay Bridge, brought in a new design team, and they created one of the great iconic bridges in the world, the Forth Bridge. And it was over-designed because it had to withstand a phenomenally high wind, much higher than was ever expected. The Tower Bridge in London was also redesigned. That also was over-designed to resist high winds. So they compensated in the future structures by almost over-designing against winds, which would probably never happen. Next, please. But nevertheless, this was what took place. So the design of the Tay Bridge, 10 pounds per square foot. The test resulted showed the wind loads actually were 34 pounds per square foot. So that so they increased it up to 56 pounds per square foot. It's interesting if you've ever been to Paris and seen the Eiffel Tower, because the Eiffel Tower is also a great metal structure, steel frame structure, but it's able to let the wind blow through it because it's filigree, it's like an open lattice. After the Tay Bridge disaster, engineers always paid very close attention to wind loading. And wind loading is a key factor, not just in architecture and high-rise buildings, but also in all bridge design and road design and so on. Next, please. We're doing quite well. We hope there are going to be some questions after this. We can talk about flooding now. Next, please. Flooding in London has always been a problem. And London used to have a very wide river. Gradually, it got boxed in with embankments, and the embankments were to gain extra land for building purposes, but also to provide flood protection. And in the Victorian period, there was a cartoon in a satirical magazine called Punch. And you can see here this old chap with a pot on his head flopping about in the river. He's called Old Father Thames. And he's saying to London, London being the lady lifting up her skirts, looks a little bit like Margaret Thatcher used to look like. And he's saying, isn't it your job to tuck me up in bed? Why don't you tuck me up in bed so I don't flop about like this? Or that's the words to that effect. And what he's meaning is, why don't you build embankments to look after me? So the early example from popular newspaper of people being fed up with flooding in London. Next, please. Well, London's the capital obviously of England, and it's a key financial centre in the world. And it is at risk. It's about 70 miles from the sea. And this picture here shows the area which are subject to severe flooding. The 5-meter contour is all that area is no more than 5 meters above sea level at high tide. So you can see what can happen. The pink area is additional flooding which can happen. And in 1953, there was a very, very serious flooding which happened on the east coast of England, and it caused many deaths. And government inquiries said, we've got to build a protection to stop the river from flooding London. And they came up with the idea of a barrier. Next, please. This is what they eventually built. It's a barrier which crosses the River Thames, just in Greenwich, not very far from London. And this barrier is a movable dam. These dams will sit on the riverbed and let boats go through, because when they built this thing, there was a large amount of shipping into London. That shipping has almost disappeared because they went for container ships which can't get up the river and so on. So the whole concept would have been different now, but it followed the pattern of the late 70s and 80s when it was designed. And this barrier used to open about 3 times every year. Now it opens about 40 times a year because of sea level rise and increased flood risk. Next, please. There it is again. You can just see, looking towards London, just from the sea looking, you can see Canary Wharf, which is a part of London which would never have been built had it not been for the Thames barrier, because that area was exposed to flooding. So one of the forms that followed failure in London was Canary Wharf and the huge increase in the financial district of London. You can just see in the middle distance the dome, which was built at the Millennium Dome at the year 2000. Next, please. This is what it looks like. And these are all connected with tunnels under the sea, under the river, so they connect that people can communicate. I think the next plan will show how it works. So there's a kind of round disc, and it's got a flat section, and it just sits like on the riverbed normally, and the river flows over the top of it, or the water flows. This is tidal, the tide's coming in and out. But when a flood's expected, they turn the disc, and this large disc goes into a dam position, and that will stop the water from coming into London. There's a problem, therefore, because there's water coming downstream as well, but then they'll have to lower it to let that water through. So they can manipulate this dam up and down, and this is the movable device, which is a very clever way and a very expensive way of protecting London. Next, please. Form really following function here because a completely new technology being developed. I should just say that the Thames barrier is still at risk from human failure, because if anyone leaves open the gates, which are all the way down the river on the flood protection, which goes down 85 miles, water could get into London by the back door. So human failure could let the whole system down. Well, I've nearly got to the end of this talk, and I just wanted to show you one of the great buildings of the world, which is Falling Water, which was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And he was one of the greatest architects of the 20th century. And he was a very brilliant designer. He was also extraordinarily arrogant. He was approached by a man called Edgar J. Kaufman, who ran a department store in Pittsburgh. And he owned a river gorge up in not very far away from Pittsburgh. And what Kaufman wanted was a weekend house, a house where he and his family could go to and look at the waterfall. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright had better ideas and thought much better to sit on top of the waterfall rather than look at it. And so he designed this building to fit over the waterfall. The engineers that he employed wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright saying, "This is not a good place to put a building. You're in a flood. You're in a basin here, and this will get flooded. The whole valley will get flooded periodically, and it will destroy your building." And he wrote back saying, "Have you no idea who I am? I'm Frank Lloyd Wright, the great architect, and I do what I please." And then he got a letter from the River Authority saying, "We will prevent you building this building because this poses a risk to the catchment and we don't want you to build it." Wright wrote back another very, very rude letter saying, I do what I want. And I will build this building because I'm a great architect and I'm working for a fine client who wants it, so mind your own business. Then they went ahead and built it. And I used to give lectures about this and went to see the building when I lived in America, and it's quite wonderful. So my lectures used to be all about organic architecture and the glories of reinforced concrete and what a spectacular house it is and all the rest of it. And it had great influence on modern architecture. Later on, when I got heavily involved in disaster risk, I used to give lectures about the dangers of building in floodplains and the problem of this building, destroyed 3 times in flash flooding and rebuilt. So, form can follow failure, but it doesn't always follow failure. Sometimes it just keeps going. Next, please. We're almost there. So a few conclusions, and then we'll have a few questions. Societies learn from disasters, and after failure, they're often open to change. Maybe in a way that they're not open to change normally. The disasters focus the mind. They do offer opportunities for radical change. My friend from China, Dr. Chico, was entirely correct. We need to think of disasters as opportunities. They can bring positive benefits for society, not just to protect disasters, but other benefits as well. Many of the innovations we take for granted result from disasters. Next time you go to the cinema and you're fed up with a lousy movie and you want to leave quickly, you might have to bang a self-opening escape door to get out. Well, that was due to progressive fires that have happened in basements where people couldn't escape, and the requirement was to have self-opening escape doors. Think about that next time. This self-opening escape door is the result of people dying. The tragedy is that it takes failure and loss to persuade decision makers to accept change and to open their pockets to pay out vast sums for safe construction. Next, please. There's no innovation and creativity without failure. So innovation and creativity seem to flourish in response to problems created through these disasters. Next, please. Thank you very much. This is my email. If any of you come across examples of form following failure or the opposite, do write to me. I'd love to hear from you and engage in discussion with you. And it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. So there might be a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Davis, for your wonderful, wonderful presentation. I've been sitting here absolutely glued to my screen, feeling like I've been watching a sort of almost a National Geographic special It's been really fantastic. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm sure there are several questions. Actually, there are already a couple of questions in the chat. But what I would like to do, I know that our colleagues have put them in the chat, but I would like to ask Professor Jalali Benoit if you'd like to ask your question in person. Jalali Benoit is one of our partners from PPU based in Algeria, and he has a significant experience in sort of seismic risk and civil engineering. So I think you guys will probably have quite a bit to talk about. So Jalali, if you would like to maybe ask your question out loud to the professor, but I do ask you, Jalali, because I know how you are sometimes with your questions and discussions, and we do have some other questions. So leave some time for everyone else.
No, just one question, a short one. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Professor Davis, for this historical overview of failure and progress and opportunities for the humanity. But this is true. This is what we hope it will be. You know, from failure we will succeed sometime. But my question is, you know, from all these failures, and you summarized them, all from these failures, and today, what is today? You know, despite all this publication and all this production of science and technology, we have the same failures. In floods, in fires, in earthquakes. What do you think? What is the problem? Is it just money, or is it just really understanding of nature, of the phenomena? Because we call disaster, but what is a disaster? Like you try to explain, like dangerous and opportunity. Like in Algeria, for example, for the Kasbah, you know, the people of the Kasbah were destroyed many times. They don't call earthquakes earthquakes. They call it in Arabic marbuha. And marbuha is opportunity.
Good.
Opportunity. You know, this is from 16th century when the Ottomans built the Kasbah. Then what do you think? What do you think the problem is between the science, technology, and decision makers and all these? What is the problem, really? Thank you very much.
What a good question. Thank you ever so much. I think there's many answers to that question. The first answer is that there is public apathy and there's public indifference. And that in a country where you don't have earthquakes very often, the energy to try and do better wanes quite quickly. If you have very frequent hazards, like we have one every year in Britain called winter, you adapt to it, you change. If you have an infrequent hazard, it causes a lot of public apathy, and politicians are concerned with short-term issues, and they therefore are not going to be bothered too much about something that happened a long time ago. So one of the most dangerous earthquakes are high intensity, low frequency events. These are always extraordinarily dangerous. It happened in Gujarat in India in the year 2000, just after 2000, after 2003, I think, where a very infrequent hazard caused absolute chaos because there was no awareness there of earthquake risk. So the first answer is frequency. The second answer, I think, is that the building stock of any town or city is huge. And much of it is quite old. There's a renewal process going on. Maybe 8% gets changed every year, perhaps. It might be less than that, but it could be a 10%. So in any city, there's lots of old structures which were built before building codes took place, and they will cause a great deal of havoc. If you take a city like Kathmandu, there are building codes in place, and they are building according to building codes in some areas, but a huge amount of the city was built before those building codes were enacted. So you have a kind of rump, a vulnerability rump in any place due to the sheer volume of old buildings, and many of which are not built to withstand earthquakes. Many of them were built to withstand earthquakes, but have been modified. For example, we've been to many places where you get a house which was built to withstand an earthquake, and it's got something called a shear wall through the middle. and that is to give it lateral strength when you get ground shaking. Many of the people living in these houses knock these walls down because they want a bigger room. They don't know it's an earthquake-resistant wall. No one's told them. They're not engineers, they're not architects. And so suddenly a house which was safe is now no longer safe. I think it's poignant to think that as society's populations grow, we're still not really doing what we could do. But we've just got to battle on. The main issue, I think, is codes. Building codes have got to be up to date, and they've got to be enforceable, which means that you don't want to be living in a corrupt country where backhanders can stop people imposing building codes. You need codes. You need public awareness of risk, and you need to train the builders and the craftsmen and the architects and the engineers in earthquake-resistant design. The engineers are trying to do a great job, but they have conferences of earthquake engineers. I went to one, 4,500 earthquake engineers, 700 from Japan. I mean, this is a big business, but nevertheless, there's still big threats. So I sympathize with your question. By the way, I would be very grateful if you could send me to my email that Arabic inscription, that word, because that's another nice evidence of well-meaning people who knew about opportunities. Yeah. So thank you for your question. I don't really know the answer. All I can say is we need to confront apathy wherever we can and challenge people and say we can build safer. We can do it. We can do it through training, we can do it through education, and we can do it through money. But we need political will, and the politicians have got to give support to this. And the best time to get that support is after a disaster. Next.
Thank you very much, Professor Davis.
Thank you.
Just a small question about Sendai framework. You know, I am a little confused about Sendai framework. From Hyogo, we went to Sendai. And from Sendai, we have to go to another thing. What do you think about this philosophy of disaster risk?
I like the idea that you have targets, and I think they might not be met, and I think the UN have got a good job to do in trying to set them. But these world conferences maybe have got to stop because it's involved far too much flying of huge numbers of people around the world. My own feeling is that we need regional meetings where people discuss regional hazards, because hazards ignore national boundaries. But I think the days of world conferences, they need to go onto the Zoom system, because we can't really afford to have all this vast numbers of people traveling around the world. And we need to set an example of having a better stewardship of carbon by not having all these huge world conferences. I've been to lots of them, so it's a bit like bolting the door after I've enjoyed them for future generations. But I do hope that authorities in the UN are going to be responsible. Obviously, you need regional meetings for flood risk, like the Mekong River covers so many different countries, and they've got to get together. That's obviously really vital. And the same applies to tsunami risk and so on. But there's no need for, I think, for these huge global activities.
Thank you.
The Sendai framework, I think it has set new targets, and there's going to be midterm reviews, and they're set for the year 2030. And let's hope that some of those targets are met. They haven't always been met in the past.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you very much for your very good questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a quick question. I see, Arthur, I see your hand is up, but there was Benedita who asked a question quickly. So I'll ask, because we are getting quite close to the end of the session, though I expect that because we have quite a couple of questions, we'll try and go through them a little bit quickly. So Benedita, I'm not sure if you're still online. Would you like to ask your question out loud concerning, you're asking about flood-resistant bridge technology?
Yes, thank you, Alberto, for this opportunity. It's really, I really want to compliment Professor Davis for his moving presentation. In Mozambique, where I live, we are facing increasingly increasingly aggressive floods. due to climate change, I guess. And bridges are being washed away. Even those old bridges that usually withstand were able to withstand river flooding, they are no longer able to resist. So is there any particular technology that could be used for for building flood resistant bridges?
Oh, you're probably asking the wrong person. I'm not a structural engineer, and I'm not sure I know. But the problem you highlight is such an important one, such a good question. So many bridges are destroyed. I was very interested once in Jamaica, where we went down a river chasm, a very steep valley, where there was a bridge across the river, and our bus stopped, and we were all taken out. I was at a conference, and the leader said, "I want you to look at this bridge because it's been a battleground. The engineers want solid balustrade on either side of the bridge for road safety reasons." He said the flood people want it open so that the river can flow in flood conditions without the bridge becoming a natural dam to block the river. So there's a battle going on. Do we have favors road safety with a solid balustrade, or do we take away the balustrade and just have it open, or with a very lattice type protection so the water can flow through? And these were both concerned with safety, and they both had opposite kind of requirements. It just shows you how difficult it is to get the right design for these things. I think that quite possibly many bridges were designed in the past for low levels of flood condition, and the flood velocity has increased, and so has the height of the water, and the bridges that were safe when they were designed, maybe 30, 40 years ago, are no longer safe. But they cost so much to replace that they're not being replaced. So I think that trying to keep pace with increasing speed of water and the height of water is quite probably the challenge. It just shows you in a way that when we design things, we should try and be thinking ahead and thinking, well, what's going to happen in the future? This is the water level now. Is the water level going to increase in height, and is the velocity of the water going to increase? And so you maybe design a bit like the Forth Bridge. You over-design it. You over-design it for the hazard because the hazard might get worse. That's all I can say, but thank you very much. May I ask, which part of Mozambique are you talking about? I'm familiar with the country. I love the country very much. Are you from Maputo?
Yes, I live in Maputo.
Yeah, I know the area, and I've been up to Beira, and you've had all these tremendous tropical cyclones, which have caused lots of chaos. But
yes,
warm good wishes to Mozambique. What a wonderful country. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benedita. Finally, Arthur, I know you've had your hand up for a very long time. So would you like to ask a question as well?
Yeah, thanks, Alberto. Not so much a question, but I'd just like to point out examples of perhaps building codes or something similar. So the one is the Haiti earthquake, Port-au-Prince versus Christchurch. If you look at the number of deaths which occurred in each one of those, and I think as far as it's an oral question of what city or what towns or whatever followed certain building codes and not. So that's one of the issues. And I think this thing, it's a very good topic. Form follows failure. So, and there's no better incident or event, as it were, which illustrates all of that as our response to these pandemics. So the disease, is also a part of the disaster situation.
Yes.
Just not a particular physical hazard, but anyway, I won't keep you any longer. So thank you, Alberto.
Thank you. Just to respond about Haiti and Christchurch, I mean, there's many comparisons. And also the Haiti earthquake happened at the same time as an earthquake in Chile. And the death toll, of course, was remarkably different. It's a reminder of that disasters are very much related to social economic the resilience or the poverty levels in the country. And Haiti was a very, very poor country, and that contributed greatly to the colossal death toll that occurred there. And in Christchurch too, remarkable progress being made in New Zealand in earthquake-resistant construction, also in Chile. So the wealthy countries, you know, maybe an earthquake will just rattle the teacups, but it can cause havoc in a poor country like Nepal or Haiti. And that's one of the tragedies. I worked in Haiti after the earthquake, and it was very poignant to see how poor people were and how poverty had affected the vulnerability of the city. I do agree with you about form following failure after the pandemic, and I think there will be big changes in behavior. I think we're going to see quite significant changes in behavior here in Britain. For example, much better ventilated buildings, people keeping their distance from each other, people observing kind of new patterns of working because of the pattern of working from home, which was beginning in Canada in the year 2000, where the government were encouraging people to work from home to reduce traffic problems, has had a tremendous intensification after the pandemic. And now most offices are saying you can work from home 3-4 days a week and the rest in the office, or work from home even more. And people are being employed, like my grandson, a job that doesn't work in any office, there's no office. So working patterns have changed. So many forms follow failure. And they're not always for the better. They might have side negative effects. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Arthur, for your very good point.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for your question. And thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of our session. I don't see any more questions in the chat or any hands up anywhere. So I know that we are probably a little bit over our usual time. Usually we spend about an hour on these sessions, but I think we've all been so intrigued and so interested by what you have to say. Oh, I think I see. Oh wait, no, somebody was just saying in the chat, very informative, thank you. And another colleague was just saying, thank you very much. And he had to go to another presentation. But I do want to extend my immense thanks to yourself, Professor Davis, for making yourself available to speak to us today. And I think it's been such a fascinating talk. And I also wanted to make quick mention related to our colleague Jalali, who asked the question and made mention of the Casbahs in Algeria. He actually presented a PPU talks not too long ago, sometime last year, where he talked a lot about sort of the indigenous technologies used to prevent earthquakes, or not to prevent earthquakes, right, as you rightly said, Professor Davis, but to rather mitigate their impacts. And I will send you also the link to that as well, because I think that was very closely related to the talk that you gave today. But again, I just want to say thank you very much. And as my colleague Benedita said in the chat, it was an extraordinary presentation. We very much enjoyed having you, and I think we're definitely going to try and get you to come back again to chat again in the not too distant future. But I just want to say also a major thank you to all the participants for making it today. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces again, and yeah, really looking forward to future PPU talks as they come about. We haven't got any talks, I think, for a little while to come. I think everyone's getting themselves ready for the big global platform at the end of this year. So I think that hopefully after that, we'll have quite a lot of insight about, what is now, how do we relate to disaster risk now post Bali conference, and sort of what new things have they come up with and what new insights have we got to share. And so really looking forward to that as well. But again, Professor Davis, thank you so much for joining us.
Really, everybody, thank you.
No, thank you very much, and we appreciate having you. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your week, and we will all see you again very shortly. Please, check out your emails once in a while. We will be posting up when our next PPU sessions will take place. But as I say, I'm sure we'll see you all soon. Thank you again very much, everyone, and have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So they are getting this page, which basically is.
Thank you.